Okay, how many here heard me talk yesterday? Good. I gave a speech, one I'm going to give today, which will include the entire statehood movement. And I had 25 minutes to do it because I was keynoting the symposium conference. I'm going to give this, and I have an hour to do it, and I have a lot of interesting slides. So I think this will be a more interesting experience for you. It's your old friend. When the University of New Mexico Press published my study, New Mexico's Quest for Statehood, 1846 to 1912, the life of this state was only 6 years past the half-century mark. Little did I suspect that one day, in 2002, I would keynote a symposium on the centennial of New Mexico's statehood for the Historical Society of New Mexico. My interest in the statehood movement was a natural one given my ongoing fascination with political history. My book on this movement was an outgrowth of my dissertation under the late Frank D. Reed, longtime editor of the New Mexico Historical Review. As a graduate student at UNM, I did not have any ideas about a dissertation subject when I began my studies in 1958. Few graduate students do when they begin their doctoral programs. Initially, Dr. Reed, in consultation with me, had suggested the famous Bell Ranch in New Mexico as a possible subject. But after some extensive research on the history of this ranch, I told him I would prefer a more political topic. It was then that he advised me to consider New Mexico's long statehood movement. He was, however, hesitant to recommend this option because of the extended period it involved. In fact, 62 years elapsed between the achievement of New Mexico's territorial status in 1850 to its admission to the Union in 1912. In the end, we decided on a study that would encompass the last 20 years of the movement. Consequently, when I graduated from the University of New Mexico in 1961, I did so with a PhD dissertation titled Statehood for New Mexico, 1888-1912. Even this shortened version of my account of the statehood movement, a perusal of the sources available, made me realize early on what a daunting project this topic could become. Indeed, there was a wealth of material available, including 7 master's theses in the school's Zimmerman Library, which dealt with the statehood movement from the late 19th century to the movement's banner year 1912. There were also 2 master's theses dealing with Thomas B. Catron, one of the first 2 United States senators to represent New Mexico. His advocacy of statehood, incidentally, was largely based upon his enormous land grants, which he thought would rise in value when statehood was achieved. While doing this dissertation, I got to meet a Catron, Fletcher Catron, over right in the Catron building, and a man, I would say in his late 50s, early 60s, very smooth. I was impressive, and I tried to probe him for some of the criticisms that people had of Catron, and he just rested off very beautifully and said, you know how those old guys were. So it was nice to meet him, and he's very, very courteous to me. An additional thesis in the Zimmerman Library was devoted to Arizona's statehood movement, often allied with New Mexico's, while another dealt with New Mexico's border problems with Texas, much of which predated my dissertation parameters. And surprisingly enough, there was no dissertation on any significant aspect of the movement, despite its historical importance to the state. No, that's okay. One of the rich resources I could utilize in my study were the Marion Dargan papers, that's coming through, isn't it? Located in the Special Collections Division of the UNM Library. Dargan was a former professor at the university who also published 3 helpful articles on the statehood movement from 1895 to 1912 in the New Mexico Historical Review. Indeed, this scholarly journal has had numerous articles relevant to statehood. Some of the other sources that were available to me included the accounts of prominent statehood advocates, such as those of Territorial Governor Bradford Prince, the author of the 1910 study, New Mexico's Struggle for Statehood. So he was one of the historians of statehood before it was achieved. Prince's papers were located in the State Record Center and Archives in Santa Fe, where the exceptionally helpful senior archivist and later state historian, Myra Ellen Jenkins, saved me a significant amount of research time. Anybody here knew Myra Ellen? She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. When I was doing research on statehood, starting in the late 50s, most of the historical papers were in the Palace of the Governors. And then the Commission on Public Records was established in 1959, so there was a separate archive where you could do this kind of research. Dr. Jenkins not only made the Prince papers available to me, but also those of the Territorial Governors, Edmund G. Ross and Herbert J. Hagerman. Not to mention the papers of that well-known chronicler of New Mexico's territorial years, Ralph Emerson Twitchell. But the state archives had no monopoly on the papers of the statehood boosters. At the Zimmerman Library, I was able to utilize the private papers of Governor Miguel A. Otero and those of the territorial delegate William H. Bull Andrews, plus those of two of the more controversial United States senators from New Mexico, Albert Bacon Fall and Holm O. Burson. You remember what happened to Fall? He was sent to a federal penitentiary because of the Teapot Dome incident or scandal. Probably the most extensive sources regarding the statehood movement, however, were found among the public documents and newspapers. These included both local and out-of-state sources published during New Mexico's territorial years. As a graduate student, I got my first impressions of the extent of available public documents dealing with the statehood movement. On the federal level, there was, of course, the Congressional Record, and earlier, the Congressional Globe, because New Mexico was struggling for statehood even before the Globe became the Record. The record includes the reports of the Committee on the Territories of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Committee on Territories of the U.S. Senate. A lot of great information about New Mexico statehood in these documents. On the local level, there were the various state constitutions proposed by the Territory of New Mexico and the conventions called by territorial leaders in support of them. The debates pro and con regarding statehood were also found in the large array of local newspapers as well as the news journals throughout the nation. Many of these stories pertaining to the qualifications of the territory to become a state provide real insights into the motivations of people in favor of admission and of people opposed to it. 2 years after completing my dissertation, I was ready to add the events of the earlier years of the statehood movement to the information researched and chronicled prior to my graduation from UNM. Taking advantage of the break time between quarters at the University of Northern Colorado, I traveled with my family to Washington, D.C. to search for materials that would encompass the entire statehood movement. In fact, I started my study in 1846, the year of the American conquest of the Mexican territory when its inhabitants were largely dispersed along the Rio Grande River. Having already traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1960, while working on my dissertation, I had already consulted the relevant collections of important papers at the Division of the Manuscripts in the Library of Congress, and perused the extensive newspaper collections in the newspaper reference room. Many of these things are now available on the web. I had to travel to get to see them. In 1863, during my second trip to Washington, I concentrated more on the state items at the National Archives than I did in 1960. Research in Washington on both trips was enriched by the presidential papers at the Library of Congress. They were all there at one time. There was information in these documents pertinent to New Mexico's statehood movement during the presidencies of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, both of whom were active in the debate that led to the Compromise of 1850, which excluded New Mexico from admission but gave it territorial status. Toward the end of the statehood movement, there was the presidency of the colorful Teddy Roosevelt, who supported the controversial jointure movement, which would have brought New Mexico and Arizona into the Union as one state, and the more conservative and judicial William Howard Taft, who would eventually support separate statehood for the two impatient and long-suffering territories. New Mexico's struggle along its path to statehood was one of the historical developments that were often outside the control of the frontier territory. Indeed, many of the territory's failures belonged to its leaders in Santa Fe, but some were the result of the political miscalculations on the part of its sole representative to Congress, the territorial delegate. There were also the suspicions, distrust, and outright prejudice in predominantly Protestant Anglo-America against this remote territory that was largely Spanish-speaking and Roman Catholic in its population. Following New Mexico's quest as part of the Republic of Mexico in 1846 by General Stephen Watts Kearny during the Mexican-American War, an American-style government was set up which became known as the Kearny Code. Even during these early days of American occupation, there was a division among the territory's inhabitants involving those who wanted statehood as soon as possible and those who had become comfortable with territorial status. The latter included American officials and military personnel who enjoyed important roles in governing New Mexico. When the sectional controversy over slavery heated up with much popular support in the country for bringing California into the Union as a free state, the statehood boosters were delighted that President Zachary Taylor supported statehood for New Mexico. Unfortunately, when Taylor died in office on July 9, 1950, his successor, Millard Fillmore, supported Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, which gave statehood to California but denied it to New Mexico. It was one of the first cases where the wishes of Congress prevailed over the desires of many New Mexicans regarding their political status. Incidentally, there were a number of constitutions that were presented to Congress, or if they passed muster with the electorate in New Mexico. One was in the Constitution of 1872, which followed the Constitution of 1850, because that was the one that had the provision, no slavery, and that's the reason, one of the reasons it was blocked in its statehood movement. California was overwhelmingly free state, and so they let it into the Union as a free state. And then there was the Constitution of 1889, which unfortunately did not have the support of many of the Hispanics and the church. And then finally there was the 1910 one, which we came into the Union under. Well, continuing. During the Civil War in the early 1860s, the U.S. government was more concerned about the Confederate invasion of the territory than any of New Mexico's efforts to become a state. Curiously enough, though, Nevada was admitted into the Union in 1864 with a population much smaller than New Mexico's in order to help Abraham Lincoln win re-election as president. In the 1870s, New Mexico had a persuasive territorial delegate in Congress named Stephen B. Elkins, who was the law partner of Thomas Catron, and he too was a very, very smooth person. They called him Smooth Steve, that was his nickname. Both of these men shared a strong motivation to have New Mexico become a state so that the value of their enormous Spanish and Mexican land grants could increase. As Congress was considering neighboring Colorado for statehood, Elkins felt that New Mexico might have a good opportunity to become a state as well. But while Colorado was admitted in 1876, New Mexico was once again left out in the cold. One possible cause for this failure was an accidental miscalculation on the shrewd Elkins's part. He had been the first to vigorously shake the hands of a Michigan congressman named Julius Caesar Burroughs, who had just scathingly denounced the South for its shameful tolerance toward the Ku Klux Klan and the so-called White Leagues. The speech triggered a thunderous applause among the Republicans. When Elkins had wandered into the House about 5 minutes before the end of this controversial oration, he hastened to congratulate the congressman along with many other enthusiastic Republicans. When outraged Southern Democrats saw this, they withdrew their support for New Mexico's admission, and once again the luckless territory lost its statehood bid. In 1889, the territory was part of an effort by congressional Republicans to bring it and the territories of Dakota, Washington, and Montana into the Union as part of the House's Springer Omnibus Bill. As New Mexico was the only one that leaned toward the Democratic Party, which is just very hard to determine, but that was what the people believed. New Mexico was eventually eliminated from consideration, while the other territories considered stronger in its commitment to the party were given statehood. As a result of this action, the division of Dakota Territory into North Dakota and South Dakota gave the GOP 4 new senators and 2 representatives, while the other 2 recently admitted states would give the Republicans a chance to add 4 more senators to their rolls, not to mention the new House members who were also added. You see why this is always a problem, because the New England senators particularly were afraid that if all these Western territories came in with their freer ideas, they would be challenged in their control of the U.S. Senate. And so this is all politics. You can see how it works. In 1890, a year later, Wyoming and Idaho were admitted to the Union, which was a real affront to New Mexico, given the popular argument that New Mexico did not have a sufficient population to become a state. Wyoming had only 125,000 people, and Idaho only 88,000 people, while New Mexico's count ranged from 195,000 to 225,000. It didn't seem fair. The importance of the free silver issue and the rise of populism in the West made the rest of the 1890s a difficult time for serious consideration by Congress of the statehood bids of Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. These states, along with Indian Territory, were the last remaining territories in the contiguous United States. In 1902, however, another omnibus statehood bill was introduced called the Knox Bill, after Massachusetts Representative William S. Knox, the Republican chairman of the House Committee on the Territories. This may have been the case of another one of those Massachusetts moderates. Thank you. It would also allow these 4 Western territories to draw up their state constitutions and organize new state governments. Indian Territory is very interesting. They were not interested in becoming a state at all. It was only in 1905 that they realized that there was some pressure that they unite with Oklahoma. And eventually they did. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Indian Territory is the eastern part of the state, not the western. That's where the 5 civilized tribes were placed. All right, let's see. In May of that year, the Knox Bill was passed. Although New Mexico's territorial delegate, known throughout the territory as Bernard Statehood Rhodey, because of his tireless advocacy for the territory's admission, had to fight diligently to prevent an amendment to the statehood bill, which would have compelled New Mexico and Arizona to join together as one large state called Montezuma. Imagine. Another state, they didn't want that name. Another state name was Acoma, that was stressed. But fortunately, New Mexico, the name has been saved. That's one thing. But the most formidable opposition to the Knox bill came from Indiana Senator Albert J. Beveridge, chairman of the Upper House's Committee on Territories. As a progressive Republican, he was especially suspicious of the role of corporate interests in the economic affairs of New Mexico and Arizona. His target was the controversial Pennsylvania Republican Senator Matthew S. Quay, who was pushing for New Mexico statehood because he had economic and political interest in the territory. His chief lobbyist in Pennsylvania politics had been the heretofore mentioned William H. Andrews, who was now living in New Mexico and working to build a railroad there, the old Santa Fe Central. Andrews, serving as the last of New Mexico's many territorial delegates, also wanted to be one of the 2 United States senators to represent the new state. This achievement would make him a valuable ally for Quay and ensure the interests of the Pennsylvania investors in their mining and transportation projects in the territory. Beveridge was able to block statehood for New Mexico and Arizona for almost a decade. He coped with the intense pressure coming from the 2 territories for admission by calling for jointure. Again, that's the joining of the 2 territories as one state. When his fellow progressive Republican President Teddy Roosevelt became a convert to Beveridge's one-state solution, the politicians in New Mexico were divided and another stalemate in the movement occurred. Catherine and Otero were not interested in jointure. They wanted a separate state, so I think in the beginning most of the Democrats and Republicans preferred separate statehood. Well, anyway, Oklahoma was merged with Indian Territory during this conflict and became a state in 1907. And this left the 2 southwestern territories out of the picture, and no other territories left except them. When William Howard Taft was elected president, he too supported the jointure movement. And the frustration would have continued if it had not been for Taft's reversal, coming out in favor of single statehood for each of the 2 territories. This move resulted in the passage of a statehood enabling bill by Congress in August 1911. It's called the Hamilton Bill initially. And Taft's proclamation making New Mexico a state on January 6, 1912, and Arizona a state on February 14, 1912. The senatorial aspirations of Delegate Andrews, Quay's alleged pawn in New Mexico's final steps in the achievement of statehood, were blocked by 2 even more savvy statehood boosters, Catherine and Fall, who were elected by the New Mexico State Legislature to serve in the upper house of the United States Congress. There was always a question, why did Taft change his mind? Well, actually, as the years went by, people began to reason that we should finally organize the rest of our western territories, and they began to move in the direction of statehood, and Taft came around to it because of that. And so they were allowed to go ahead and draft constitutions and ask for admittance. But it's very interesting. At this time, Arizona was a very small territory in population, and it was very liberal. And it put in its state constitution the recall of judges. And do you remember what Taft became after he retired from the presidency? Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So he was very judicial, and many, even among the progressive Republicans, did not like the fact that you could recall judges if you didn't like their decisions, and vote them out. And so when Arizona put that in, this once again jeopardized New Mexico's prospects for admission, because when the bill for a separate statehood for Arizona and New Mexico were presented in Congress, a senator from Ohio, Joseph Foraker, came up with an amendment that both states had to approve of the statehood. This was when the jointure movement was really strong. Or one no would defeat the whole purpose. And so this was the problem. They had to really get both states in. New Mexico's Constitution, on the other hand, was considered too difficult to amend. And it was a more conservative document. And Taft called it a safe and sane one. Teddy, on the other hand, much more progressive in his views, thought it should be more open to people willing to change things through amendment. So what happened is Taft said no to all this, and so they had to redraft the bill and allow and require Arizona to drop the recall of judges, or no statehood for them. And New Mexico had to take a position that it would amend the Constitution, but its survival in this kind of thing was not quite as desperate in this case. So what Arizona did is they voted in the 1912 election for their new officers, and they voted out the recall of judges. And then in the general election later on that year, they put it right back in. So you can just only control so much, I guess, from Washington. New Mexico, on the other hand, that's blue ballot amendment. And this kind of, the Democrats generally supported it because it would have made the Constitution easier to amend. And the Republicans were split, and George Curry, who was one of the last territorial governors in the state, came out for it, and the blue ballot amendment passed. And if you're attending this convention, this afternoon there's going to be a paper by Gus Seligman on the blue ballot and Bronson cutting. It might be interesting if you like New Mexico politics. So going on in here, if you had a chance to look at my book, you know that there's real question as to why Andrews was denied one of the 2 Senate seats. And according to one pretty sound story, people who were probably behind fall, we don't know for sure who they were working for, but El Figo de Vaca was involved in this, and they turned around with the New Mexico Mounted Police, and they arrested 4 legislators pledged to Andrews and put them in jail during the vote and then let them go. And this was kind of interesting because it happened often in New Mexico politics where there was very, very severe factionalism, as many of you know. Well, I think one way to gain insight into the attitudes of the people outside of New Mexico regarding the admission question is to peruse the newspapers back east, which I did in preparing both my dissertation and statehood book. There was the usual belief that New Mexico was an almost ungovernable frontier territory with Apache raids and often political violence, such as that riot in Mesilla on August 27, 1871, between Republicans and Democrats, which resulted in the death of 9 and the wounding of 40 or 50. That's kind of bad publicity. But the journalistic criticism of the territorial residents of New Mexico tended to go beyond those of the rest of the rough and ready Western Commonwealths. For instance, the New York Times, in its March 3, 1875 issue, described the people of New Mexico as being, quote, ignorant and utterly destitute of enterprise and public spirit, end of quote. The Chicago Tribune, in its January 10, 1889 issue, referred to the territory's population as, quote, not American, but greaser, persons ignorant of our laws, manners, custom, language, and institutions. Now, this kind of talk goes all the way back to Daniel Webster for the 1850 uh, Compromise of 1850. And so it went back a long time and so unfair. The Cincinnati Commercial on March 3rd, 1875, to continue this, insisted that those people of, quote, Mexican descent, end of quote, in the territory were almost, quote, wholly ignorant of the English language and thus alien to us in blood and language. It blamed the territory's high illiteracy rate on the Catholic Church, which had enjoyed, quote, uncontrolled sway, end of quote, over New Mexico for generations. There were voices in Congress that did not support the embattled territory, such as that of Democratic Representative Joseph E. Washington of Tennessee, who was quoted in the Congressional Record in 1893 as saying that the people in New Mexico of Spanish or Mexican origin were just as much citizens of the country as the people in Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska who had come to the United States from Europe during the previous 8 or 9 years, which is telling my grandparents. That's when they came. His view, while certainly reflected in many news journals in New Mexico, did not have much popular support during most of those years when the territory lobbied for statehood. Since the publication of my statehood book, there have been a number of published studies on various aspects and personalities of the statehood movement. My direct involvement in the chronology of this long struggle for admission largely ended with the publication of my study on the populist movement in New Mexico in 1974, in which I discovered new facts about some of the personalities in the statehood movement. And after that, I became involved in other studies, which Thomas cited in his kind introduction. These projects that I pursued, biographies of the Dakota Sioux Indians and so forth, did not keep me from reading about the historical movement in journals such as the New Mexico Historical Review, and in some of the excellent monographs which have helped put more meat on the bone, if you'll forgive the cliche. One publication that stands out because of its thoroughness is the revised edition of Howard R. Lamar's The Far Southwest, 1846-1912, published in the year 2000. If you ever get a chance to read that, he's really a very thorough scholar. I especially liked Lamar's discussion of the Santa Fe Ring, that the pernicious influence of which I did not include in the summary of the statehood movement. In this banner year, we have scholars participating throughout the state in symposiums celebrating New Mexico's centennial. There's a lot of places downstate that have already had their celebrations. In our meeting here in Santa Fe, we have papers dealing with aspects of the statehood movement, such as the Blue Ballot controversy, which I just suggested, or the controversy in statehood roles of such political figures as Beveridge, Catherine Edmund Ross, and James S. Calhoun. Many of the participants in this conference are either working on some aspect of the movement or have published a history of the state with its emphasis on its involvement in the admission fight. And one book that impressed me a great deal was the author. It was David Holtby, who was with the UN Press for many years, and he's got a book called The 47th Star, and he presented his thesis in that in a paper dealing with this book. And what he did is he looked at the state's efforts to become a state during the years between 1894 and 1912. Took that period and really focused on it. In addition to providing new insights into the political careers of Catherine and the younger Miguel A. Otero, and of course that arch opponent of separate statehood, Senator Beveridge. He has 2 chapters on the attitudes and concerns of the Hispanos, Indians, African Americans, and Asians living in the territory during these tumultuous years. There's a book coming out on African Americans in New Mexico too. I met the author yesterday. Professor Richard Melzer and former state historian Robert Torres both of whom are involved in this Centennial Symposium, have published a new book, which I'd like to suggest you might want to look at. It's on New Mexico. They collaborated with Professor Sandra K. Matthews of Nebraska Wesleyan. It's titled A History of New Mexico Since Statehood. And this book is aimed at a younger audience, and it presents a concise view of the achievement of statehood. It reminds its readers that 20 Western territories were added to our 48 states before New Mexico. And it discusses the Constitution of 1910 and the amendments added to it after statehood had finally become a reality. And I suggest it because it's got so many illustrations, photographs, charts, maps, and sidebars that I think really would appeal to a new audience of people drawn to the richness of this state's history to benefit us all. Well, this is the end of my talk, and I took more time than I thought it would. Do you have any questions? Because I really have time. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the title of that last book you were talking about, you said it was for a younger generation?
It is, yeah.
It's like young adult or? Young
adults. Mm-hmm.
And the title again?
It's called, let me get it out here, it's called A History of New Mexico Since Statehood. Now, one of the authors, Sandra Matthews, gave me a copy. Now, this is for kids. I read every bit of it because it was so easy to find out, and I could see kids just saying, hey, God, this is history, this is great. So I recommend it because I couldn't stop reading it. Any other questions? Yes?
Now, I'm curious, in your research, did you ever run across anything about New Mexico's outstanding, or the territory's outstanding railroad debt? You ever come across anything like that?
Not a lot. The railroads in New Mexico are really busy, and I did a lot of research regarding the railroads in New Mexico. Actually, my interest was sparked by Bull Andrews and the building of the Santa Fe Central, which connected from on the southern Pacific up from connected Torrance with Santa Fe, and then it wanted to go down to Albuquerque and be part of a great railroad network, which would benefit the Pennsylvania investors some $50 million extra dollars. Railroads were really powerful forces in the history of the state. And as a matter of fact, the 1872 Constitution had a railroad regulation provision 7 years before the railroad even got to the state. And they were kind of anticipating that, along with the liberal homestead law in the '72 convention. So they were in politics. They were when the 1910 Constitution was being formed. The man they put in charge of the Corporation Commission was Holm Lord Burson, very conservative man. And so the railroads had no problem with that. But people were always coming up with money all over the West to get a railroad to come, and then they had to pay it back. But I never concentrated on that. Any other question? Yes?
Yes, in your presentation you mentioned about why New Mexico was really denied statehood because other people were considered ignorant and unruly and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever look into the aspect of why this was one of the reasons why statehood was denied? My family comes before this one here from Santa Fe before the statehood, so in essence I think you're talking about my my family. Wasn't really the ignorance was because of the lack of monetary system, which was not available here in New Mexico.
Yeah,
Because of the platoon system, because of the different systems that they had that were quite productive, quite a society that was, they needed New Mexico just because of the border, more than what they needed it for political reasons.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions here.
Yeah, I know.
One is,
Sorry.
why did they feel this way? And there are good reasons, not good, but I mean, there are understandable reasons. First, you know, we were as a country at this time, we were pretty much Northern Europe, even though you had this big Italian immigration in the late part of the century. They were pretty much Protestant and went back to the city upon the hill, the Puritans and so on. And here these were the people that were part of the Mexico we stole, the Mexican-American War. And they wanted to come in as a state and they know nothing about our traditions and our system and our language. And Senator Beveridge was really, he was kind of notorious in many ways. When they were debating the jointure bill, that he wanted to join the two states together, and he took a tour through, New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory, and interviewed people. And he knew how to pick the right people, I think, because one person he interviewed, a very judge, said that the literacy rate was only 33% in New Mexico. And people believe that. And, you know, I don't know how much it was, because, you know, and then the foreign language, that was something that really emboldened the people to be critical like that. And New Mexico, Arizona was 29%. So this is the kind of information that came back during the late years, and people evidently believed it because their congressman balked. So that's one thing. It's as I said, Daniel Webster criticized them. It was a kind of a zealous nationalism, I think, in New Mexico, because it was part of old Mexico. It was considered those folks, not us folks.
What about Texas, though? What are the parallels with Texas? And I don't remember when Texas was admitted, but of course, for a long time, Texas didn't want to be. It wanted to be its own country.
It was a nation. It was a Republic of Texas. Yeah, it came in just prior to. I think it came in the 1840s. And that's right. Texaco had a Hispanic element, but there was an awful lot of enterprising Anglos that poured in there, and they became a nation, as you know. And Sam Houston was president, and they just appeared as American because they all went in there and took this over. And whereas New Mexico was liberated by Kearny's army. Yeah. The way that, you know.
What was it that the 1889 Constitution that was unacceptable to the Spanish population?
Well, I think the thing that really concerned the church, and the church was really spearheading this, was that the original draft of the Constitution said that they could tax the people to support public education down to the county level. And so they began to realize that there was not a lot of sympathy for this idea. They felt threatened. So J. Francisco Chavez, who was the Republican leader, called the delegates back, and only about half of them came. But then they reworded the provision to indicate that, in a sense, below the county level, the Roman Catholic Church could still have its own schools. You know, that didn't keep them, but you know, that was their concern. That was the main reason. And they put it to the people, it was voted down.
How did the requirements for bilingual education get into the 1910 Constitution? How was that?
Oh, yes, we'll say this, that in 1910, with Solomon Luna there, they had ironclad provisions to guarantee that Spanish would not be denied an education, would not be denied the right to vote, separate ballots, and this was necessary to bring along the Hispanics, who were in the vast majority at the time, and so that worked. And said that Solomon Luna. Have you ever heard of him? He was the great Rico county named after the southern part of New Mexico, and it was said that all he would have to do was lift an eyebrow, and people would say, "Oh, Luna's against that." and the amending procedures for the Spanish people to amend anything dealing with them required 3/4 of the legislatures to vote for it, 3/4 of the House members to vote for a change. You had to have 2/3. You had to have the counties vote, and any vote had to be at least 2/3 of the population. Almost impossible. Whereas it was much more liberal in terms of everybody else. Well, and I think that was probably very necessary because these people were the majority after all. Yes? Yeah.
Didn't it seem like the ignorance was on the other side, that us all coming here as immigrants, that there was a lot of short-sightedness and lack of cultural understanding?
I mean, Anglos who came to New Mexico later?
No, the politicians that were really preventing New Mexico to become a state due to the saying that they were ignorant, lawless, not understanding the culture in itself, whereas they had all come from different cultures.
Well, there was-
The ignorance was on their side, not
Oh,
New
yeah,
Mexico's
well,
side.
yeah, I see what you're saying there. They never realized that they spoke another language and they had a different cultural background, which they were going to keep when they came here. And what they were asked to do was to respect the environment of New Mexico. I think it's probably worked out fairly well. I mean, this is a fascinating state. When I came down here to do my doctorate, that's just great. I loved it. I still do. Yes.
Well, I wanted to say I read your book, not long after it came out. I was given a copy to my grandpa. I read it in like in the 70s. And then I read it again recently, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's one of the best pieces written, or one of the most inspiring. Anyway, there's some confusion that I have about this anti-Catholic and this anti-Hispano and so on, and these great distances and so on, leading towards New Mexico's struggle for statehood. Because at the time period, there were waves and waves of Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, all Catholic, Louisiana, a French Catholic place, you had Florida, Hispano, Texas, California, Arizona, Colorado. It seems to me that something is missing here, and I think a new point that's coming out about New Mexico's problem against statehood was that New Mexico could not really pay the debts and the liabilities of the territory, as indicated by the Act of 1897 with Congress granting the territory land, and then provisions in the Enabling Act, and then provisions in the Constitution, making it available, making funds or land available to pay these debts and liabilities. And it was something that was kind of kept hush-hush. It's not something that you come out and say, well, we're not going to let New Mexico become a state because New Mexico is a dead. You know, you don't, among polite people, you know, especially people that are heavily vested, you don't say that. You know, and it seems to me like that is really a more realistic reason for why New Mexico was denied statehood.
You know, I think that they were saying somewhat the same thing, except they used what was a more politically correct language. When you talk about don't understand the culture, can't speak the language, you're kind of referring to these are strange people like the Italians, the Poles, and so on are becoming Swedes, who you know. I think when these people came through Clinton Garden, where the earlier immigrants came through, and Ellis
Castle Garden.
Castle Garden, that was Clinton. Sure? I think it is. And also the Ellis Island. These people were coming to the new country with a commitment that this is going to be their land. They moved into various parts of the country, learned the language. They were integrated because they were there, whereas New Mexico was this beautiful territory in the Southwest where they lived apart and they were keeping up their own cultural values. And so this is what I'm saying on that.
I think that's really a good point because our assumptions about the other person are so influenced by so many things. And the so-called black legend was a pretty powerful thing that was in existence. And I think it was Senator Adams, in one of his last great speeches in Congress, said, absolutely, we should not attack Mexico. And people forget that. There were people fighting in our federal government saying, you do not, Hope or whoever it was, we do not go in and take over. But then that got washed aside. And I think what happens sometimes is people get comfortable with being the people in charge. And I think your point about how there's such a strong, particularly in New Mexico, such a strong heritage of we're going to do it our way. It wasn't being stubborn, it wasn't being naughty, it was a matter of life or death for so many generations. And so that coupled with a kind of really a narrow-minded, prejudiced point of view. And I'm from Massachusetts. I was raised thinking, oh, isn't Daniel Webster wonderful? And I've come to find out he was actually a really naughty guy. Whereas Adams, who's been forgotten about that,
John Quincy, you're talking about?
Yeah,
he was,
great speech.
Yeah, he was.
And I so think there must be parallels today of great people who are trying to speak up about common, normal, regular, good sense. And it's difficult.
Yeah. Are you all familiar with the Black Legend? Yeah, okay, you know.
I just wanted to make another point about what was going on in the upper states at that time. That Catholics were not accepted. You know, Catholics need not apply. It wasn't so that they were being we're being bombarded with immigrants that they didn't approve of because of Larson, because of their religion, but also because they were many of them because they were from the southern part of Europe. So they were already under threat, they felt. So that to add to that another problem, an even bigger problem.
Well, the Know Nothing movement.
Yeah.
They know nothing. They don't like Catholics. The American Protective Association is not as well known. The KKK in the 20s. So yeah, there was that factor as well. Yes,
Just a comment, it is pretty much proven that most of all the immigrants that came in to New Mexico were brought in by the railroad. And different cultures thrived because of the railroad. Some of the people came in and helped make the railroad, and upon that, they brought their families from wherever. It was not really because of any kind of monetary reason except for the railroad. It was a place where they could come and start a new life.
yeah, that's true. That's,
You know,
yeah,
like go on and on.
yeah. Actually, the population surge eventually had Anglos out and Hispanics. And then the two cultures still seem to live together. Yeah, any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.